Welcome to World at Work TV. I'm Allison Avalos, and I'm joined today by Sandra Pace and Michael Sherry of Stephen Hall & Partners to talk about executive incentive plans. Sandra, first talk about why organizations might be struggling to maintain their executive incentive programs.
Well, so there are a lot of key players to consider, both internal and external, that go into designing an effective incentive compensation program. One of the things that oftentimes companies struggle with really who to please first, right? So they have many internal considerations, executives to attract and motivate and retain, as well as achieve, how to achieve those performance objectives and pick performance metrics that executives can control effectively and responsibly. Kind of answering to certain external groups may not always be beneficial to the company, right? So if you're trying to answer to some of your institutional investors or really your external constituencies, you might be trying to achieve a goal that they're interested in and not what's necessarily good for the company. Also, there's oftentimes not enough shareholder engagement. And so company shareholders may not necessarily know why you've picked certain performance metrics or why your plan operates the way it operates. And the more communication you have with your shareholders and your investors can be very beneficial to you and to having an effective program.
My answer would be goal setting. Sandra and I, being in the industry, time and time again, we hear that the most difficult thing companies are struggling with is goal setting. They often say, I don't have a crystal ball, I can't see into the future, I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, let alone a year. So this is oftentimes very difficult for companies, and an incentive plan, particularly an annual bonus plan, is only as good as the goals that are set. If the goal ends up being poorly set and wasn't really achievable or realistic, the whole plan is demotivating and doesn't really work out for that year. You get a chance to renew and reapprove goals the next year, but you're kind of locked in for that year. So a plan is only as good as the goal. And the goal is only as good as the business planning process. So companies really struggle with the planning process and how to set the targets. And it's not just about targets. It's oftentimes the stretch goal where you make your maximum payouts, because companies struggle with making it difficult but yet achievable. You don't want it to be too pie in the sky where you're incenting executives to do something that might pose a material risk to the company. Oftentimes companies will turn to discretionary payments and things of subjective nature to sort of as a fix-it-all patch for things like this, where things don't work out in a year because the goals were poorly set. But in today's environment with say-on-pay and enhanced disclosure requirements, it's tougher and tougher to talk about discretion and to use it, and companies shy away from it.
It sounds like a lot of the pieces that you both are mentioning are things that you would also hear about just in the front end with design, with good program design. And then they sort of rear their ugly head if you don't get it right when
Absolutely.
You're trying to maintain and care for a program. Do you find that organizations are really aware of the amount of maintenance that's needed on these programs and have the flexibility to adjust design components when they need to?
I do think that both executives and the board, because they're ultimately who approve many of these executive annual incentive programs, I think they are aware of a lot of the complexities and intricacies that are involved in designing these programs. It's not just first and foremost, right, as Mike said, you need to consider your business plan and your strategic plan, long-term plan going forward. But it's all of the other pieces as well. And as you go through designing your program, I think boards and executives are really cognizant of the fact that we got to make sure that this program will achieve the objectives that we want it to achieve, but also consider all of the other key players and constituents.
And we're usually in the boardroom for the discussion on what metrics to choose for these incentive plans and what the goal should be. And these are not short conversations. Executives and the board take it very seriously. There's usually a lot of back and forth. So because companies know they need to put the time in up front to have the right metrics and the right goals for it to work throughout the year. Of course, you get a chance to do things over the next year, but once those goals are approved by the committee, you really can't do too much. And you don't have as much flexibility as some think, because oftentimes you can lose your tax deductibility and 162M compliance if you change things midway through the plan.
So what are some of the emerging considerations when it comes to short-term plans and the pitfalls that you sometimes run into?
Sure. So one of the big things, we're seeing companies return to the concept of discretion. It was there a while ago, back in the 90s, but then enhanced disclosure requirements kind of caused companies to move away from it. But companies are returning to it. They're having the courage to sort of make these discretionary payments or subjective payments and talk about them and disclose them properly and really tell their side and why they did it. This is viewed as a valuable risk mitigation tool in incentive programs because executives have comfort knowing that if they try to perform and if certain uncertainties are there that caused performance to not be there for an incentive plan payout to occur, perhaps the committee will use their discretion to pay them out something. So this kind of, will stop them from being incented to do something that might be more risky than the company would like to get an incentive plan payout because they know that the company may use discretion at the end of the day.
I think just another kind of short-term plan consideration to kind of avoid potential pitfalls, is disclosure. I think I mentioned it a little bit before, but I think your CDNA is really your marketing document, and that's how you want to address why you chose the performance metrics you chose, explain it to your shareholders, and really just put it all out there. I mean, sell it to the extent that you can and why it's important to the company. You're going to need to discuss when you don't achieve certain performance goals and the reasons why, or why you perhaps had to apply negative discretion to one of your named executive officers. Going into that head on and talking about it, it just makes a lot of sense, and it can avoid some headaches as well. And it's really goes into best practices a lot and what you want to do for best practices.
And one more thing we often see sometimes now with the uncertainty in the goal setting process and the difficulty companies have in setting targets and stretch goals is the use of a range for a goal. So instead of EPS being a precise down to the penny, the target will have a range of maybe plus or minus 10%, that if you hit in that band, you get a target payout. And this sort of helps remove some of the uncertainty in goal setting.
So what are some best practice considerations, Michael?
I think companies want to consider what metrics are the right metrics to choose. And there's some thoughts there. First off, you want metrics that work in tandem, that are really complementary to each other. Like, you don't want a plan to be over-reliant on one metric or to have so many that executives don't know where to direct their focus. You also want to make sure that your plans, both on the annual and long-term side, work in harmony with the metrics. You want to avoid double dipping in that both plans pay out significant portions based on the same metric. That is definitely something that companies want to consider.
And I think just to add to that a little bit is, I'm probably repeating myself ad nauseum, but communication is also important internally and externally. You want to make sure that folks understand the goals and the program, but you also want to make sure you discuss it outside to the street and such. You want to cap your incentive program, your payouts, which most companies do now. The uncapped payouts is a thing of the past, and for good reason. It's really been kind of adopted as a best practice to cap your incentive program. You also want to use discretion when necessary. In certain situations, it might not make sense to make the payout at the amount that the formula calls for. So you might have to apply some type of negative discretion to account for the state of the company in general, and also just to make sure that the program in general is balanced. So your incentive program will help to benefit your overall compensation program and provide an appropriate balance between fixed and variable compensation, as well as short and long-term compensation.
Thank you both. For World at Work TV, I'm Alice Navalos.